Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about a proposed SAS related to a very important topic, which is audit evidence. So let's dive on in here. So first and foremost, we know that we are seeing changes in audit evidence. We know we see changes in how people are doing business and how audits are being provided. And the AICPA was asked to take a look at the audit evidence rule. If you're not looking at a single piece of paper and you're just testing things by throwing it in a data analytics solution and it's popping out errors and potential issues, what evidence do you need to support this, right? So when we look at blockchain and we look at some of the new and emerging technologies, we really aren't sure what audit evidence is going to look like. So in June of 2019, the AICPA issued a new proposal for SASs, so Statement of Auditing Standards, looking at what do we need in terms of evidence. And they really wanted to look at the evolving area of audit data analytics, but also other technologies and technologies that we can't even think of today that are coming down the future, right? We don't want to be thinking about the procedures we perform today and can perform today, but thinking more about what is our possibilities in the future. And so comments are due September 18th of 2019 if you have an interest in this area. So as I said, there are a lot of emerging audit technology. We have artificial intelligence, robotic process automation or RPA, blockchain, and they're great. They're great opportunities, but they're also great challenges. And so the SAS is going to use the term automated tools and techniques. And they are going to refer to both the emerging audit techniques and emerging technologies in this area. So we don't know what's coming. So we're going to just try to be as vague as possible. But think about overall, does it really matter how we do our audit? What does it mean to have quality audit evidence? So a little bit of change in thinking. So AUC section 500, the current version, extant 500, is focused on procedures, right? What procedures do we have to perform in order to have a sufficient appropriate evidence? They totally changed this up. The ASB said, you know what, when we look at sufficiency and appropriateness, we're going to be really focused on what does it mean in terms of the evidence itself, the quality of the evidence, the what is, we're not going to look at it from a focus on what is the procedure, but more on how do we think about the nature of what's being performed and is it appropriate given the tools and techniques we're using. So what does this look like in reality? It's going to focus primarily on understanding what attributes and factors to consider instead of focusing on what procedures we perform. Because procedures are going to change, right? How we do our audit is going to change. But what are the attributes and factors that we would assess in order to determine what is sufficient, appropriate evidence? And then that is what they're going to establish. They're going to add these new concepts. And we got a new cube. So it looks like the COSO cube, only it is very different. There is a big movement away from the concept of the current definition of sufficient. So if you look in today's AUC 500, sufficiency is a measure of quantity. How much stuff can we get, right? As opposed to when we think about appropriateness, that's a quality, right? So sufficient, appropriate was how much and what quality. And that's not what we're going to be thinking about, because if you're looking at an automated solution, quantity is not necessarily a driver of what would be sufficient evidence, right? So when we think about sufficient, appropriate evidence, they're going to move away thinking about these automated tools and techniques and the nature and the sources of information. They're not going to think about sufficiency in terms of quantity. They're going to talk about it in terms of persuasiveness. So audit evidence is sufficient, i.e. persuasive, when an auditor would be persuaded to reach conclusions for the auditor's purposes based on the consideration of the evidence. Huge change in how we think about sufficient, appropriate evidence. The more significant the conclusion being reached, the more persuasive the evidence needs to be. So we don't necessarily need more evidence, we need more persuasive evidence. And when we think about this, the amount of audit evidence is not necessarily a determination in this scenario, right? Having more of the same type of evidence that's not really sufficient and appropriate is not going to help us, right? So if you are getting, the same type of audit information, can't compensate for the lack of appropriateness. So number sufficiency isn't going to help us. However, if we have very reliable and very relevant information, a single source may be persuasive. So we're moving away from quantity and into persuasiveness of the evidence. So as I promised, here is our cube. You can see here we have the relevance and reliability broken out into what are the attributes of relevance and reliability: accuracy, completeness, authenticity, and risk of bias. And then the sources, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the changes here, but when we look at management, provided by management or identified by the auditor, we now break it out actually into 5 different theories. And then, is it contradictory evidence or is it corroborating evidence? And so really changing how we evaluate, not focused on procedures, focused on the actual evaluation of evidence. So reliability and relevance, right, are going to be used in our evaluation, right? Those are the key drivers of that cube. So that front face there where the COSO elements would be, right, that's where we have our attributes related to relevance and reliability. And when we're looking at this, we need to obtain evidence that has accuracy and completeness, right? So we have to make sure that our audit evidence is accurate and complete, and evaluate whether it's sufficiently precise and detailed enough, right? So we're really looking at what is that focus. So when we think about relevance, it's information that's relate to it, right? It's logical, it bears upon the assertion. Versus when we think about this, when we think about what does it mean to be relevant, is it, meeting the objective of the procedure? Right? If it's not related to the objective, then the evidence isn't supportive. The account balance to which it relates, and the period of time to which it relates. So when we think about relevance, right, we want to make sure that we're looking at the evidence and we're looking to see whether it truly is going to give us the information that we need. We also want to make sure that it is reliable, and they give us 4 different attributes related to reliability: accuracy, obviously that's important, completeness, authenticity, and then a huge focus on risk of bias. One of the key elements in this proposal is related to professional judgment. There's a huge focus on professional skepticism, that questioning mind, looking if there is indications that something is not corroborating and is in fact contradicting the evidence out there. You're going to see a huge focus on professional skepticism. So that risk of bias is very important. So when we think about the sources, as I mentioned before, we used to break them up into 2. Obtained by management, or obtained from management, and obtained directly by the auditor. That is not how we're going to look at it anymore. So now we have management generated internally from the financial reporting system, generated outside the financial reporting system, including sources external to the entity, and obtained from management specialists. So they are going to move the current section 500, where we have management specialist, is actually going to move to section 501 as a result of this. Then from the auditor, it was obtained from sources external to the entity, or the auditor actually developed it from sources either internal or external to the entity. So we'll actually be breaking out those sources into smaller sections as we look at the type of evidence that we're receiving. And then again, is it corroborating evidence, right? That it's going to give us assurance, or is it contradictory, right? And if it's contradictory, what do we do with that information, right? To not consider it in isolation, but in part of all of the information that we're obtaining, what do we do with that information? Now, we still do have to do procedures, and we're going to consider whether the results of audit procedures are reasonably expected to provide a basis. And you'll notice that we still list many of the procedures we talk about today. So we have inspection, observation. I put a little dot there next to external confirmation because one of the changes that they're proposing in here is allowing oral confirmations. Today, an external confirmation must be in writing. One of the reasons why they're looking at this is very interesting. They're considering if it's relevant, right, and it's reliable, then how much evidence do we need, right? Thinking about sufficiency and persuasiveness, if it's a higher risk area, maybe we do need it in writing, or maybe we have to do other corroborating items. But if it's a lower risk area, perhaps it's being enough to be oral. So thinking about who gave it, do they understand what they were talking about? Are they the right person to ask? So they've done a little bit of change here related to external confirmation. Recalculation, reperformance, inquiry. And then I'm going to put another star next to audit data analytics. Technically, they do not believe that ADA in of itself is a actual classification of a procedure. They actually combine it with analytics. But they basically say that it can actually apply to multiple different areas, and they're going to incorporate a lot of examples of how audit data analytics would work in procedures. So when you read the proposal, the actual beginning is very short. The requirement is very, very short. There are tons of application guidance depending on where you are in your audit, maturity. Are you really embracing all of these new technologies? Are you still doing a very traditional audit? And they have everything in between in terms of audit evidence. And so that's something I'm really excited about. So audit data analytics, lots of examples, but they don't believe in and of itself it's its own type of procedure. And then analytical procedures and looking at that information. So one of the areas, professional skepticism, as I said, a key element of this proposal, the auditor has to determine what modifications or additions to procedures are necessary to resolve the matter. And then when we look at it, is it consistent from one source versus another? And do we have any doubts about the reliability of the information? And then what would we do in those scenarios? So again, thinking about that next step. If this is approved, they are proposing currently an effective date of financial statement periods beginning on or after June 15, 2021, which would be our June 30 and our December 31, 2022 year ends, just to give you perspective on when this would be effective if everything goes according to plan. All right, so that's it for our very high level overview. This is a really awesome proposed SAS. I highly recommend that you take a look. There are things that I like. There are things that I think could be improved upon, perhaps a little bit more specificity in certain areas. So I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a step towards trying to answer some of the questions many people have had for a long time about do I have sufficient appropriate evidence in a more modern audit? And I think that's something we do have to really embrace as we see changes in the audit profession. So I am so grateful for you joining me today, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.